Okay, today we are looking at chapter 10 of the story. We talked about this in the small group time in our Sunday school earlier today, but we're to the point in Israel's history, we're at the very end of the time of the judges and going into the time of the kings. And the title of the message is Be Careful What You Ask For. Now, I've told you all before that I'm the youngest child in my family. I have 3 older brothers, so I'm the only girl. The boys were all a lot older than me, so that meant while they all had each other, I had me. I didn't have anybody to play with, and what I most wanted while I was little was a sister. Somebody to play with. Well, children, they figure they have to do things for themselves sometimes. So since my parents weren't doing anything about providing a sister for me, I kind of took matters in my own hands. So at the end of every day, when I do my "now I lay me down to sleep" prayer, at the tail end of that prayer I would say, "Lord, please turn my baby doll into a sister." Now, see, I believed that God could do anything, right? And I every night I prayed that. He did not see fit to turn my baby doll into a baby sister. And I know my mother was greatly relieved over that because she was glad to be done with all of us by the time I came along. And God, you see, knew that a yes answer to that was not in my best interest, and it certainly wasn't in my mother's best interest. But God knew that this was the prayer of a child. So His answer was a firm no. But what about when grown-ups send up prayer after prayer to God, and He knows that answering that prayer with a yes isn't in the best interests of those people? Sometimes God answers with a yes just to show the prayers that they don't know best, and that they should yield to His will, and that there are consequences when they don't. This was the case in today's scripture. We're going to look at this story, this part of the story today, in 4 parts. The first part, the people ask for a king. The second part, the candidate is revealed by God. The third part, the candidate is anointed as a king. And then the last part, we're going to look at that king's job performance. Because, I don't know about you, but in our office, Gene and I have this saying that says, it's not what's expected that matters, it's what's inspected. That's what people do, okay? So we're going to inspect the king's job performance. The story starts out with this childless mother, wannabe mother. She wanted a child more than anything. And she made God a promise, didn't she? She says, "God, if you will grant me a son, I will give him back to you." And sure enough, God did give her a son. And sure enough, she gave him back to God when he was 3 years old. It would have been terribly hard to do, wouldn't it? But she kept her promise, and God was faithful to her and gave her more children to love at home. The young boy, his name was Samuel. Remember, we're looking at names of these Old Testament people, and anytime we see an E-L in a name, we know that means what? God. Exactly. Samuel, heard by God, I think is what that says. But he went to live in the temple with the priest Eli and grew up there, just full of promise. God had especially blessed that child from his birth. And now, when we're reading this part of the story, he has become an old man. In fact, that's what the people came to him and says, Samuel, you're old. I don't know how I would feel about somebody coming up and saying that to me, but I guess he was all right with that. Well, before this in the story, the priest, of course, had been Eli, and his two sons, as we talked about today in the Sunday school, were not just the most shining examples of what you would want your sons to grow up to be. They took part in idolatry, so they worshipped other gods, and here they were, priests of the high God Yahweh, but they worshipped other gods. They were corrupt. You could slip them a little bit of money and get some special favors. They were not good people. But now, history is repeating itself, because even though Samuel grew up seeing this kind of an example, his own two sons, just like the sons of Eli, had also started taking bribes and acting in some very unpriestly actions. The leadership of the judges who had been ruling over the country up until that time kind of went straight downhill, to the point where the people and the other leaders of the country, the ones that had been looking at the people around them all this time, they came to Samuel demanding a different kind of government. They wanted a monarchy. They wanted to be a kingdom, set a king over us. See, they argued that Samuel was now elderly. Samuel, you are old. In other words, very ineffective. Now, nobody in here would ever say that to somebody, would we? You are no longer effective because you're old. No. But they said, well, nobody knows how long you're going to be around here. Well, that part was true. But they didn't want Samuel's sons to come to power after something happened to Samuel. So they wanted a different kind of government set up by Samuel while he was still alive. They wanted a new leader. They wanted a king, because everybody around them had a king. That king, they thought, was going to be able to solve all their problems. Ha! I don't know of a king yet who's been able to do that. But here's the way this part of the story is told. We're going to pick this up on page 135. Kind of close to the top of the story here, the top of the page. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as the other nations have." So what do you think what kind of an effect did that have on Samuel? He didn't like this much, did he? This was kind of a slap in the face to him. He was the last judge of ancient Israel. Up till this time, they had been ruled by judges. Samuel was the last judge. So it's kind of a slap in the face to him. They had no problem with the way he had ruled over them. They had a problem with who was going to be succeeding him. So what they were really doing was insulting God. Samuel didn't want to give up the old familiar ways. We're kind of like that. Maybe it was because of his status. But God let them know that the people's desire for a king wasn't a rejection of Samuel. It was a rejection of God Himself. And we pick that up just beyond where we just read. And the Lord told him, Samuel, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. Okay, I'm going to give you what you wanted. I'm going to give you a king, but there's going to be some consequences to pay. And we know that that happens, don't we? Up until this point, even though judges led the people, Israel was ruled by a theocracy, a country ruled by God. God gave the guidance to the judges in turn passed it on to the people. So when the people were asking for an earthly king, it was God that they were rejecting, not Samuel. So God decided to let the people have what they asked for, so they would realize how good they had had it under God's reign when God Himself was in control. And we see that again a little bit further down the page. This is what the king who will rule over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys, he'll take those for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. Wow. Do you think the people listened to Samuel's words? Not on your life. Let's see what they said. Right below that it says, but the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. Apparently they don't remember what happened when Gideon had the army that was whittled down from several thousand to 300, and they defeated the thousands of men that were fighting against them because God did it for them. They forgot all about that. So, Samuel is being sent to the tribe of Benjamin to look for this strapping young lad named Saul. Good looking and at least a head taller than anyone else. He looked the part of a king. Today we would say he looks presidential. He looked kingly back in those days. But Saul, he's kind of a reluctant king. And he knew nothing about this at this time, of course. He had gone looking for some lost donkeys. When he had trouble finding them, one of his servants suggested that they contact the seer, the prophet, Samuel, for some help. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, God tells Samuel that he's sending a man to Samuel who's going to be Israel's first king. And what happens during that meeting? The kingly candidate is told that the donkeys are no longer missing, they've been found. And Saul just really can't quite figure out why such an important man is spending quality time with him. And he replies down here on page 137, he says, but am I not a Benjaminite from the smallest tribe of Israel? And is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me? Because Samuel was bragging on Saul at this time. So we look just past that. It says, Then Samuel took a flask of olive oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him, saying, Has not the Lord anointed you ruler over his inheritance? Can you imagine what was going through Saul's head at this time? Someone he is coming and saying, Oh, by the way, you're going to be crowned king of Israel. You know, that's kind of unheard of today, because right now we have a succession, don't we? Like in England, we have Queen Elizabeth, and we have her son Charles and his son, and his son. So we know who's going to be king. But in Israel, there was no line. So there was no succession of kings. But this is exactly what happened to Saul. He just out of the blue was anointed by Samuel. When he got up that morning, he had no idea that when he went to bed that night, he would be the king of Israel. Think about that. So, what did this brave, stalwart king-in-waiting do after Samuel's visit? Did he go start getting together a cabinet of advisors? Did he start getting out the encyclopedias and looking up to see what a king is supposed to do? No. When it came time for him to be introduced to the country as their king, somebody had to go hunt him down because he was missing in action. He was in hiding. But even though he got off to this rocky start, he became a powerful leader of Israel's army after they finally got him on the right track. But the powerful start didn't last very long. Samuel, the prophet, the last judge of Israel, he kept urging the people to turn away from their idols. And we see over on page 141 where Samuel says, Do not be afraid. You have done all this evil. Yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do for you no good, nor can they rescue you because they are useless. For the sake of His great name, the Lord will not reject His people, because the Lord was pleased to make you His own. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you. These people had slapped him in the face, yet he still prayed for them. And he says, I will teach you the way that is good and right, but be sure to fear the Lord and serve Him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things He's done for you. Yet, if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will perish. The people and their king didn't always follow God's lead, though, did they? When Israel's army that Saul was leading was at war with the Philistines, the enemy was winning. So Israel did what they did best when things weren't going their way, and they started praying to God. It's funny how they wait until the bottom falls out before they think of God, isn't it? What did King Saul do? We're told that on page 142. It says, Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. Saul waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. See, Samuel was supposed to come and bless the troops, ask for God's help with them. Samuel wasn't there on time. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. At this point, they didn't have a whole lot of faith in their leader. So Saul said, Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offerings, just as he finished making the offering, Samuel showed up. And Saul went out to greet him. You see, Saul figured he knew better than God did. But God knew best. The person that... I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. After that time, there's another time when Saul didn't do as he was commanded by God. But what happens this time was that he took matters into his own hand to make the sacrifice that the priest Samuel should have made. Was Saul a Levite? Anybody remember what tribe he was from? Benjamin, exactly. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. Benjaminites weren't priests, the Levites were. So it was up to Saul to make the offerings. Samuel to make the offerings, and Saul took matters in his own hand, thinking he could do better than what God had said. But we are shown another time when Saul did wrong, and that's down further in the page on 142. Samuel said to Saul, "I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt." Now this was years and years before, when the Hebrew people came out of Egypt and they were on their way to the Promised Land, and they wanted to go through the land where the Amalekites were living. The Amalekites would not let them, and they actually attacked them. So God is saying, now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. This was a very severe punishment, wasn't it? Why would God order such a command? Surely the women and children could have been spared, right? But God had a reason for this. And it tells us further down the page, at the very bottom of that page, it says, "Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. One person was spared. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed." Saul figured he knew better than God, but God knew best. That one person that Saul spared, Agag, we're going to see down the road a problem that came up because of one of Agag's descendants. Way down the road, when the children of Israel are in exile, somebody reared their ugly head, and he was called an Agagite. Who knows what that person's name was? His name was Haman. This was during the time of Esther, and Haman took it in his head to completely rid the world of Jews. Does this sound familiar? That could never happen today, could it? It nearly happened back in the 30s and 40s, of last century. Adolf Hitler decided the same thing, but Haman was an Agagite, and that order to exterminate all the Jews came about from him, who was a descendant of the one person Saul spared because he didn't carry out God's orders. Haman could have completely wiped out all the Jews in the land of Persia, all because Saul didn't obey God's orders. It was a simple thing, yet it could have been a catastrophe. So what's God calling you to do today? Are you listening for His voice like little Samuel did when God called him in the middle of the night? When we pray, we spend a lot of time talking to God, don't we? But how much time do we spend listening to God? When God gives us orders, do we, like Saul, think we know more than God about how to do these things? Do we think we know what's best for us, when in reality God knows what's in our future? Let's all resolve today to spend as much time listening for God's replies as we do lifting up our own requests. Would you bow your heads with me? Father God, help us to spend at least as much time listening, and maybe even more time listening for your words as we do giving you our own requests and the things that we want from you. Help us, Lord, to listen for your voice. And we thank you for giving us this means of communication with you. Amen.